Antarctic history is full of bold, daring men who explored new places and men who advanced the cause of science. But there are no other figures in the history of the Antarctic who did so many significant things so successfully as Carl Anton Larsen. Larsen was born in Vestfold, Norway on the 7th of August 1860. By the time he was 21, Larsen had earned his master's certificate and took part in the growing trade in northern bottlenose whales. Due to the increased demand for baleen, Sandefjord-based company Oceana sent Larsen on 2 expeditions to look for whales in the far south in 1892 and 1893. Larsen became the first to land on Seymour Island off the Antarctic peninsula, where he collected a number of fossils, including petrified wood, which proved for the first time that the region had once enjoyed a much milder climate. He crisscrossed the Weddell Sea, pushing through the ice as far south as 68 degrees 10 minutes south. Larsen had made significant geographical contributions, including the first documented ski excursion onto what would later be named the Larsen Ice Shelf. Inspired by Larsen's findings, Swede Otto Nordenskjöld planned an expedition to the same area as Larsen had explored, and invited Larsen to captain the ship Antarctic. While most of the crew were Norwegian, the scientists were Swedish and an Argentinian. On the 10th of January 1902, they made their first Antarctic landing. The goal was to reach as far south along the peninsula as possible in order to establish the winter base. However, heavy ice around 66 degrees 10 minutes south prevented them from continuing, so Nordenskjöld selected Snow Hill as his base for 6 men. Returning to South America, the crew experienced the worst weather conditions any of them had witnessed. I told the crew to settle their accounts with God, because I cannot promise we will survive the night. It is a serious thing to hear we may not have long to live. I hope that God will be a merciful and forgiving Father who does not weigh our errors on a scale, or we would all be damned. Surviving the night, they spent a month in Grytviken on South Georgia, which Larsen considered had huge potential as a harbour and a whaling station. They then headed to Ushuaia to inform the government of Argentina and the Norwegian-Swedish embassy of the location of Snow Hill, and to conduct scientific studies in Tierra del Fuego. On 5th of November, Antarctic headed south to collect Nordenskjöld's party from Snow Hill. The ice made it impossible to sail through the Antarctic Sound. Andersen, Duse and Grunden were left ashore at Hope Bay with a depot of provisions, with the goal of bringing Nordenskjöld and his men to a place where they could be picked up, while Larsen turned back yet again to try to find a different passage. Failing to reach Nordenskjöld, the 3 men spent a miserable winter, living off of the supplies from the depot and the 700 penguins they had killed. Meanwhile, things had gone no better for Larsen and his crew. On the 10th of January, an ice floe was forced under the ship, opening holes in the hull. Larsen hoped to ground her on Paulette Island, but the ice was too heavy, so on the 12th of February, he ordered the men to transfer the boats, food and other supplies and equipment to a large ice floe. Shortly thereafter, Antarctic sank under the ice. Larsen's party of 20 now found itself some 45 kilometers off Paulette Island. forcing the men to travel through the shifting ice towards it, ferrying their stores from floe to floe and hauling the boats across rough ice. After 16 days of hard toil, they found themselves surrounded by open water. Launching the boats, they rowed for 6.5 hours, finally reaching Paulette on the 28th of February. Larsen's first task was to oversee the construction of a double-walled stone hut and the desperate need to find food. 1,900 Adelie penguins were killed and cached. Throughout the winter, Larsen held his party together by keeping them to a rigid schedule. As nobody knew where they were, Larsen had to go for help. He knew that the Snow Hill location was known, and their only hope for survival was to get there. 6 men at Snow Hill, 3 men at Hope Bay, and 20 men at Paulette Island spent the winter unaware of each other. Finally, on the 31st of October, Larsen and a party of 5 set off in the boat, rowing for Hope Bay some 80 kilometers away, fighting treacherous currents and dangerous ice. The party finally arrived at Hope Bay on the 4th of November, only to find the hut deserted. After reading a note in the hut, they followed them towards Snow Hill. Waiting out a severe storm, they set off on the 145-kilometer journey across the now perilous Erebus and Terror Gulf. Shortly before Larsen arrived at Snow Hill, the Argentinian corvette Uruguay had arrived to search for the missing expedition. Larsen and his 5 men came walking in just as the ship was about to leave for Buenos Aires, and they could then collect the rest of the men from Paulette Island. Back in Buenos Aires, Larsen received an animal rights medal for keeping the ship's cat alive during the year at Paulette. And he captivated his audience with his stories of the multitude of whales he had seen and his vision of the bright future of commercial whaling in the south. A company was registered in Buenos Aires under the name Compañía Argentina de Pesca Sociedad Anónima, Pesca. Larsen was to command the whaling fleet and to manage the shore station for a minimum of 5 years. Larsen wasted no time in the massive task that confronted him. He was determined that Norway should benefit from his scheme. On the 23rd of July 1904, Louise sailed from Sandefjord. The ship carried the entire future South Georgia factory plant on board. Stocks were so plentiful that production was restricted not by the catch, but by the capacity of the boilers and the lack of barrels. Larsen successfully remained in charge of the operations in Grytviken until 1914. He had the church in Grytviken built from his own money and personally paid the salaries of the priest and doctor. He moved back to Norway and eventually initiated large-scale whaling operations in the Ross Sea, building the first whaling factory ship, and became the first to make an argument for quotas of whaling in different areas. He died in the Ross Sea on board Sir James Clark Ross during his second successful expedition in 1921. Strangely, Captain C.A. Larsen is mostly forgotten today, despite having captained ships in Antarctic waters, discovered new features on land and ice, skied to places where no one had been before, led heroic rescue attempts in an open boat, made significant scientific discoveries, and had perhaps the greatest economic impact of any individual ever in the far south. This is a celebration of one of the key figures in the history of the Antarctic. The leader, the visionary, the pioneer, and the manager.